The courageous prophecies of Isaiah that challenge and inspire. When we think of courage, our minds often go to acts of bravery in the face of visible danger. But what about the kind of courage it takes to speak truth into a world unwilling to hear it? Isaiah, the prophet, carried this kind of courage, a quiet, steadfast bravery that echoed not only in his own time but across the centuries to challenge and inspire us today. Picture Isaiah, a man standing against the tide of corruption, idolatry, and despair in his nation. His words weren't just poetic, they were revolutionary. They weren't just hopeful, they were confrontational. He called out kings, rebuked nations, and painted vivid pictures of a future shaped by both judgment and redemption. But let's pause and ask, if you were in Isaiah's place, would you have had the courage to speak such truths, knowing it might cost you everything? Isaiah's prophecies begin with a startling clarity. He doesn't tiptoe around the issues of his day. He declares boldly, "Woe to the sinful nation, a people whose guilt is great." It's like walking into a crowded room and pointing out the elephant that everyone else is too afraid to mention. Think about this. How often do we see wrongs in our own world, whether in our workplaces, communities, or even within ourselves, and remain silent? Why is it so much easier to stay comfortable, to avoid the friction that comes with standing for what is right? Isaiah didn't have that luxury. His calling demanded action. And here's where it gets even more profound. He wasn't just speaking to kings and rulers. His words were meant for every person who had wandered from truth, for every soul yearning for something deeper yet caught in the snares of a broken world. His voice was not merely one of condemnation, it was also one of invitation, an invitation to return, to rebuild, and to renew. Now, let's bring this closer to home. Isaiah's world, filled with corruption, false priorities, and disconnection from the divine, feels eerily familiar, doesn't it? You and I live in a time where distractions are endless, where self-interest often trumps collective well-being, and where truth itself feels negotiable. So, how do Isaiah's prophecies challenge us today? What do his bold proclamations inspire us to do in a world just as messy as his own? One of the most striking aspects of Isaiah's prophecies is his vision of hope in the midst of judgment. When he speaks of the stump of Jesse or the coming of Emmanuel, he paints a picture of renewal that defies despair. He doesn't sugarcoat the pain or the loss, instead, he acknowledges it fully while pointing to something greater, a future worth striving for, a light breaking through the darkness. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you allowed hope to guide your decisions, even when the circumstances around you felt hopeless? Isaiah teaches us that hope isn't about naivety or wishful thinking. It's about grounding ourselves in a vision of what can be, even when everything around us screams otherwise. Do you have that kind of hope? If not, what would it take to cultivate it? Let's dig deeper into Isaiah's prophecy of the suffering servant. This figure, described as despised and rejected by mankind, is a paradox of power through humility. The servant doesn't conquer through force but through sacrifice. This prophecy, often interpreted as a foretelling of Christ, isn't just about one person, it's a blueprint for how we are called to live. What would our world look like if we embraced this kind of power, not one rooted in dominance but in love and selflessness? Think of the last conflict you had. Did you approach it with the goal of winning? Or did you seek understanding and reconciliation? Isaiah's servant challenges us to redefine strength and to find courage not in overpowering others but in lifting them up, even at a cost to ourselves. Let's not overlook the practical implications here. Isaiah's call to justice, to defend the fatherless, plead the widow's cause, and seek righteousness, is as relevant now as it was then. Imagine how different our communities would be if each of us took these words to heart. What would happen if we stopped waiting for someone else to fix the broken systems around us and instead took action ourselves? But here's the tension: acting on these truths isn't easy. It wasn't easy for Isaiah. And it won't be easy for us. Courage doesn't mean the absence of fear, it means choosing to move forward despite it. And so, Isaiah's life asks us a question we can't ignore: what are you willing to risk for the sake of truth? For justice? For hope? Isaiah's prophecies are not just historical artifacts, they are living, breathing challenges to our complacency. They dare us to look beyond our immediate comforts and to live for something greater. They remind us that while the cost of courage is high, the cost of silence is even higher. So, here's my challenge to you, as you reflect on Isaiah's words. What is one step you can take today to live more boldly, more truthfully, and more lovingly? What is one area of your life where you've been avoiding the hard truths? And what would it look like to confront them with courage? From prophecy to purpose, living out Isaiah's call in a world that needs courage. When we think about living out the words of Isaiah, it's tempting to relegate them to history. Imagining a prophet speaking to an ancient people in a distant land. But Isaiah's call wasn't just for them, it's for us. It's for you and me. It's about the courage to see clearly, to act boldly, and to love fiercely in a world that often resists transformation. Isaiah didn't merely diagnose the problems of his time, he offered a vision of what could be. And that vision wasn't small. It wasn't safe. It was revolutionary. He spoke of a time when swords would be beaten into plowshares, when nations would no longer rise against nations, and when the wolf would live with the lamb. It's easy to dismiss these words as poetic idealism. But what if they're more than that? What if they're a roadmap? A challenge? An invitation? Let's start here. How often do you allow yourself to dream of a better world, not just in abstract terms, but in vivid, practical detail? What would your workplace look like if collaboration replaced competition? What would your community look like if empathy took precedence over apathy? Isaiah calls us to imagine. Yes. But also to act. And acting means stepping into discomfort, into the unknown, into the messy work of reconciliation and renewal. Take the imagery of swords into plowshares. It's not just about ending war, it's about transforming tools of destruction into instruments of creation. This isn't just political, it's personal. Think of the conflicts in your own life. What swords are you holding on to? Resentments, grudges, fears, and how could you reshape them into tools for growth and peace? Isaiah's vision of peace isn't passive, it's deeply active. Peace doesn't just happen. It's cultivated, fought for, and sustained through effort and intention. It requires us to confront the violence, literal or metaphorical, that we harbor in our hearts. So here's a question for you, when you think about your own relationships, your own choices. Where do you see opportunities to turn swords into plowshares? Isaiah also gives us the image of a child leading the way in a world made new. This isn't just a symbol of innocence, it's a call to humility. Children approach the world with wonder, curiosity, and a willingness to learn. They don't cling to their own power or pride. What would it look like for us to approach life with that same spirit? To lead not with arrogance but with openness? Now, let's ground this in today's world. Think about the divisiveness we see everywhere, in politics, in communities, even within families. What if we took Isaiah's words seriously? What if, instead of contributing to the noise, we chose to listen? What if we sought to understand rather than to win? Isaiah reminds us that the path to peace isn't paved with dominance but with humility and understanding. But Isaiah doesn't stop at peace and humility. He also calls for justice. And justice, real justice, is never easy. It demands more than words, it demands action. Learn to do right, seek justice. Defend the oppressed. These aren't suggestions, they're commands. Think about the oppressed in your own context. Who are the marginalized? The overlooked? The silenced? And what are you doing about it? It's one thing to feel compassion, it's another to act on it. Isaiah doesn't just ask us to care, he asks us to change the systems that perpetuate injustice. And this brings us to one of the hardest truths of all: living out Isaiah's call will cost us. It will cost our comfort, our time, and often our pride. But what's the alternative? To live in a world unchanged, unchallenged, and unredeemed? Isaiah dares us to believe that the cost of courage is worth it. That the sacrifice of self leads to something far greater than self-interest. But here's the tension: how do we balance bold action with patient faith? Isaiah speaks not just of what is but of what will be. He proclaims a future shaped by God's justice and mercy. But he also acknowledges the waiting, the tension, the not yet. This is where faith becomes essential, not just faith in a distant, abstract sense, but faith in the here and now. Faith that your small acts of courage matter. Faith that your steps toward justice, however imperfect, are part of a larger story. Faith that even when you can't see the results, you're contributing to the renewal Isaiah envisioned. Think about this: when was the last time you acted on faith, real, risky, uncomfortable faith? Faith that required you to step out of what was safe and into what was uncertain. Isaiah's life reminds us that faith isn't about certainty, it's about trust. And trust, by its very nature, requires vulnerability. As we move forward, let's not forget Isaiah's ultimate message: hope. Hope that isn't blind but grounded. Hope that isn't fleeting but enduring. Hope that isn't passive but active. This kind of hope changes everything. It changes how we see ourselves, how we see others, and how we engage with the world. So I ask you, what does hope look like in your life right now? Is it something you cling to? Or is it something you live out? And if it's the latter, what does that look like in practice? What steps are you taking to bring hope to a world that desperately needs it? Isaiah's words challenge us to live with a profound sense of purpose. They invite us to move beyond ourselves, to step into the tension of the now and the not yet, and to become part of a story far greater than our own. Courageous living, becoming the prophets of our own time inspired by Isaiah. If Isaiah's life teaches us anything, it's that courage isn't reserved for a select few, it's a calling that belongs to each of us. Isaiah was not extraordinary because he was fearless, he was extraordinary because he faced his fears and spoke truth in spite of them. And isn't that what we're called to do? To step into our own lives with the kind of boldness that transforms not only us but the world around us? Let's think about this deeply. Isaiah's courage wasn't just in the words he spoke but in the life he lived. He didn't merely point fingers or highlight problems, he embodied the hope and vision he proclaimed. He stood as a living example of what it meant to trust in something greater than himself. Now, let me ask you, are you living in a way that reflects the values you claim to believe? And if not, what's holding you back? To live courageously, we must first understand what it means to see clearly. Isaiah had an unflinching ability to confront the reality of his world, the corruption, the injustice, the idolatry. But his clarity didn't end with seeing what was wrong, he also saw what could be right. And here's where it gets personal. How often do you stop to really see the world around you, not just its flaws, but its potential? Imagine this: you're standing in the midst of chaos, whether it's a broken relationship, a challenging workplace, or a divided community. What if, instead of being overwhelmed, you chose to see the seeds of renewal? What if you believed, as Isaiah did, that even in the darkest places, light can emerge? What would that change about how you act? Isaiah's vision wasn't just about what he saw, it was about what he did. He called people to repentance, to justice, to hope. And this is where we often falter. It's easy to see problems, it's harder to take action. So here's the challenge: what's one thing you can do today to embody Isaiah's call? Maybe it's reaching out to someone you've been avoiding. Maybe it's standing up for someone who needs an advocate. Maybe it's simply speaking a truth you've been holding back. But let's not romanticize this. Living with this kind of courage is messy. It's uncomfortable. It's often lonely. Isaiah knew this firsthand. He wasn't always welcomed or celebrated, he was often rejected, misunderstood, even ridiculed. And yet, he pressed on. Why? Because he understood that the truth he carried was worth the cost. What about you? What truths are you carrying that you're afraid to share? What would it take for you to step beyond your fear and speak with courage? Isaiah reminds us that the measure of our lives isn't found in our comfort but in our conviction. And let's not forget the source of Isaiah's strength. It wasn't his own power or wisdom, it was his deep connection to something greater. He didn't act alone, he acted out of a profound sense of calling. A belief that his life was part of a story much bigger than himself. This raises a crucial question for all of us: what's your source of strength? When life gets hard, and it will, where do you turn? Isaiah's life shows us that courage isn't something we muster on our own, it's something we draw from a deeper well. For Isaiah, that well was his faith in God's promises. What's yours? As we think about how to live out Isaiah's call, let's return to one of his most powerful images, the suffering servant. This isn't just a prophecy about Christ, it's a call to each of us. It's a reminder that true strength often looks like vulnerability. That true leadership often looks like service. And that true victory often looks like sacrifice. Let me challenge you here: what would it look like for you to live as a servant in your own life? In your family? Your workplace? Your community? How would it change your relationships? Your decisions? Your priorities? Isaiah's life and words remind us that courage isn't about grandeur, it's about faithfulness. It's about showing up, day after day, even when it's hard. It's about trusting that your small acts of love and truth and justice matter, even when you can't see the results. But let's take this one step further. Isaiah didn't just live with courage, he inspired it in others. His words weren't just about his own time, they were about the future. About us. And this is where his legacy becomes our challenge. What if you saw your life as a prophecy, not in the sense of predicting the future, but in the sense of shaping it? What if your words, your actions, your choices were planting seeds that would grow long after you're gone? What kind of future are you creating through the way you live today? Isaiah dared to believe in a world redeemed, a world where justice and peace and love reign. Do you? And if you do, what are you willing to do about it? Isaiah's courage wasn't just about standing against what was wrong, it was about standing for what was right. It was about believing that the darkness doesn't have the final word, that the light will prevail. And it was about living in a way that reflected that belief, no matter the cost. So let me leave you with this: what would your life look like if you lived with Isaiah's courage? What would change about your priorities, your relationships, your choices, And what kind of impact could you have if you dared to speak? To act? To love with that same boldness? Isaiah's story is far from over. It's written in the lives of those who dare to live out his call. Who dare to see clearly, to act boldly, and to hope fiercely. Will you be one of them?